Hi, I'm Renee Ballard, the host of Let's Talk Design. Today we're talking with Joanne Kellock. Joanne is the Chief Executive Officer of the Design Institute of Australia, also known as the DIA, and she's had the role since 2015. Joanne's career has always centred around design, and prior to becoming the CEO of the DIA, she was the Executive Director and CEO of the Council of Textile and Fashion Industries of Australia, also known as the TFIA. With a career spanning business, education and the not-for-profit sector, Joanne views design across the spectrum of a practicing designer, an educator and, of course, a savvy businesswoman. Hi, Jo. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Renee.
When Chris and I started Lex back in 2018, we immediately joined the DIA, and that was because previously I'd worked in media where industry associations are absolutely intrinsic as a part of the success of the whole industry. So it was a no-brainer for us to join the DIA. And then when I joined the Vic-Tas Council, State Council back in 2019, that's when my path directly crossed with Jo. And then for 3 years, which was during COVID, we worked on various projects together, did a lot of Zoom calls together. And it was during these events that we were organising that Jo taught me an absolute gold nugget piece of advice. We were booking some kind of event and we needed to work out what kind of speakers that the guests would want to hear from. And Jo said, and we were throwing out these big fancy names, and Jo said, and it was for graduates. And Jo said, when you're climbing Everest, the person you want to hear from the most for advice is the one who's one step ahead of you. And I thought that went straight in. I've never forgotten it. So aside from enjoying, obviously, our time together, that was... So, yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. I'm glad to be here. And don't forget, Renee, you did all that work with the students too, which was really helpful from our point of view.
That was so fun. Yeah, it's funny, we've got a graduate working with us at the moment, and it always reminds me of those days. With your whole career centering around design, obviously you love it, but what's your favourite part about it?
Well, I love working with designers, really. They're wonderful people. The diversity of the disciplines, the design disciplines, because we cover all the disciplines. So these are no 2 days are the same, and no two problems in the disciplines are really alike. And I tend to look for the things that they have in common across all the disciplines, like materiality is something that they have in common, trends, intellectual property, legislative frameworks. And I'm a bit of a problem solver, so I sort of like the challenges that they're facing. Interestingly, the design industry itself is not subject to a lot of regulation in the same way that some of the other industries are. In fact, the discipline that has the most regulation is the interior design, because they're in the construction industry. But fashion, for instance, is fairly, if you've got $75, you can register a business name, you can start up. So you get a diversity of people within the sectors, and they all have challenges. They're at the start of their career, mid-career, end of a career. But it's very interesting work, and I love it.
Oh, totally. I think you hit the nail on the head, like with design and, speaking of students and things, one of the things that I always tell the graduates is the reason a career in design is sustainable is because you're problem solving every day, and that's satisfying sense of achievement, and it keeps your monkey mind occupied. But when you're just coming in and doing the same job every day, I mean, oh my God, I'd rather put hot pins in my eyes.
Exactly. And I think, designers tend by nature or characteristic tend to be quite progressive. So not all of them, but a lot of them in their political views and in the way they approach things. And, they're wanting to be at the forefront of a lot of things. So that keeps, I talk about currency of knowledge and information and skill sets. And so that keeps you interested, because you're always being exposed, especially in positions that I sit in. I'm getting pieces of information coming from everywhere. And so it gives you quite a good perspective on what's going on, finger in the pie, so to speak.
Also, I think designer as observer, like I find often designers, especially actually designers and creatives, are observers. And I think sometimes it's because we don't always fit in. So it's easier to watch than be a part of stuff, because we can be a bit quirky. But also, there's just this great observational thing. And I think that's what helps with progressive thoughts and adopting new things. Yeah, because there is nothing worse than a laggard designer. They're hard, with those ones that know it all and been there, done that. It's almost like when it's time to hang up your graphite pencil.
Well, it's better to keep let's just say it's better to keep an open mind if that's your profession, if design is your profession, and certainly to be open for what your clients' needs are, because you are coming up with in most cases, a commercial solution. But not always. Sometimes they're free to do their own things, which is fine as well.
Yeah, sometimes it's scarier. I always find a brief with lots of boundaries is the easiest brief, because it helps steer the solution. When someone gives you a blank page, you're like, oh no, please not the blank page.
I've learned not to do that in my role. Never give them a blank page, seriously. Always give the design group or our committees and that a brief, a contained brief, something drafted to work on. So there's boundaries on it. Otherwise, you'll have 1,000 ideas and progress will be slow. And they're familiar with a brief anyway, so they like to sort of, okay, let's tackle this and go into this, what can we do? And from that, you get ideas come. It's not that we don't want the ideas, it's just that we need to keep moving because things are changing rapidly. That's kind of what I enjoy about the design profession. There's always movement. There's always new ideas. I mean, every time I open a newsfeed, there's another adjective in front of the word design or designer, there's new and emerging titles that I'll see another one and I think, where did that come from? Because they are free to do it at the moment. We do have defined what they call OSCA codes with the ABS for the design disciplines, and there's 4 main categories with that. But generally speaking, there's nothing in the legislative environment that prevents them from putting an adjective in front of design and calling it something. I used to get frustrated with it because I thought, this isn't helping at all. But then someone said something, I was actually on a podcast that I was listening to, and they said that when people do that, it's like a bridge to what's coming in the future, because the current language doesn't define what they do. So, and we're seeing that in the qualifications in design with things like the new emerging disciplines in sort of service design, experience design. So when we look at the qualification of service designers, a lot of them have got an industrial design qualification. And when I talk to the teachers and lecturers in industrial design, they say, Jo, that's because there's a big service design component in that qualification. So what we're doing is dismantling the qualifications and taking the bits and then renaming them, as in the case of service design. And we're seeing the same thing happen with graphic design when we've got experience design. And a lot of these positions we're finding, like service design, strategic design, experience design, are in the corporates. I was told the other day that, the ANZ Bank have a design team of 100. The accounting firms have had big design teams, the big accounting firms, and they're sort of hidden. It's not coming up in the statistics, but when IP Australia back in COVID in 2020 released a report that they did into the design sector, and they equated Australia's design sector as 67 billion contribution to the GDP, and the same size in employment numbers and gross turnover as the construction industry. So it's one of those disciplines that sort of flies under the radar. It's one of the issues I have with the sector, the design sector, because they're not politically savvy as a group in terms of their skill sets in lobbying and advocacy and how to approach government and who you should be talking to and what pieces of legislation should you be keeping an eye on. It's not something we teach, and it's not in a designer's, it's not even on their radar.
No, and I think this is Pandora's box. We could really go down because I bang on about this all the time, is I don't think design in Australia is valued. And I'm lucky that we work with a lot of clients overseas where design is very valued, and we are never fail to be shocked how quickly our ideas and concepts get embraced overseas compared to here. Here is a lot more no, and over there is a lot more how. And when I say over there, I'm talking Europe, Asia, and the Americas. So there's that, but also, so yeah, I don't think design's overly valued, and so I think that's why it's all fractured. And when I started this out, and like I write about, is everything. If Mother Nature didn't make it, someone did, and it had to be designed first, goodly or poorly. That's subjective, but there's that. And then to add further what you were saying before about the universities, and this is almost controversial, but I understand the universities are, I assume, under pressure to do commercially viable degrees, but universities can't teach commercial acumen. Well, they can teach commercial acumen, but not to do with design. Like those design degrees need to be those lovely old school, like industrial design. I don't even think they do woodwork anymore, or they certainly don't do welding anymore down at some of the Melbourne unis. And then, like, really, university is to teach us critical thinking, exploration, research, open mind. It's a beautiful explorative space. And when we get these graduates in, we interview them, and their folios are with these fake briefs. And I understand the unis are under pressure to do this, but I'm like, you will not know the stress of delivering a boutique hotel until you are sitting opposite the client and you've accidentally missed the brief. That's when you're going to get your grade handed to you, which will be your ass on a platter, and that's when you will learn. Before that, I just want you to know about, like, what's a flange and what's a hinge and what's, how does all this go together? Or I need you to know the really old school basics, and getting hungry is what will teach you the business stuff.
Well, I think, in many ways, the education system, going back to first of all, talk about the value of design, how we value it here in this country. I actually, as I've got older, I've come to appreciate what I call frameworks that sectors work in, particularly professions. If you look at other professions like medical, accounting, they've got themselves organised and they have a structure in place where they recognise, and that creates value. Now, I've had this argument with some of our younger members who don't want an accreditation scheme, but they usually open the conversation by saying, I don't feel valued. Our work's not valued. And I'm said, well, you can't have it both ways. If you've got no structure in place that creates the value, then it's open slather. You're in the free market with no protection, and it doesn't work. And so when I talk about frameworks, I'm talking everything about the definition of your profession. What is it? What is it you do? What's the task list? The qualifications, the naming of qualifications, and the education system that surrounds it. The legislation that you're subject to, and all designers are subject to OH&S legislation, whether they like it or not. There's everything from intellectual property, green rating schemes, like there's a whole suite of what I call frameworks that surround. Everyone thinks that they're working in a free society. They're actually not. The chair you're sitting on, the size of the door, everything's got a regulation around it. The thing that worries me in the Australian design sector is that what I call the frameworks have been left to commercial forces from other sectors for a long period of time. In some cases, it's only a matter of tweaking, but we need to start paying a lot of attention to them, particularly with the tsunami that's about to hit us in AI and the changes that will be coming as a result of that, with the technology changes. So I just think a lot of our focus is going to be on that area, and we need to develop better relationships with our Commonwealth and state regimes to, establish the value that a designer brings to the table. And the other thing is, in Australia, the word innovation is bandied around a lot. We put a lot of money into research. But who do you think commercialises the science and the research? It's a designer. And a lot of that credit is going under the umbrella of innovation, and the designers aren't being recognised for their contribution. And somehow we've got to get the designers closer to our researchers as well. Looking at, if I asked any designer, have you got a researcher in your contact list? The answer would be no. No, I don't really talk to them. I don't have any need to. I wait for the suppliers to come to me. Where in actual fact, we think the Australian government sinks a lot of money into research. We've got very good research facilities in this country. And we need to get the design community talking to our research community in much bigger ways.
Because we were renowned. Australia was known, for the ute the Hills hoist, these things we always trot out, the Victor mower. And remember the CSIRO used to be like its own huge body, and and so they kind of went hand in hand because it was like things were properly tested and markets obviously, like you were saying, are researched, and then we innovated on top of that. But I feel like research is great, but it's also sometimes it has to go hand in hand with the creative. You have to do something with the data, and sounds like that's that breakdown you're talking about.
Well, there's a lot of materiality. That's one of my advanced materials. I've got an interest in that area. There's a lot of research being done in those areas, particularly in the recycling, what we're trying to do with the circular economy. And I think when we talk about trends, but there's also another trend is just not colours in sort of fashion and trends in shapes and silhouettes. Trend can also be about, I know the US Defence Force were doing a lot of research into black because of night vision and that sort of thing. And there's work, Swinburne University were doing research into butterfly wings because of how they reflect the light and show off a different colour, right? And I think we need to put some more effort into things like that other than just trends in terms of, this colour's in this season.
Yeah, and also situationally as well. Like, I think back to the 90s in Australia, speaking of fashion, and do you remember the swing from the 80s, which was, shoulder pads, big hair? Then we went into androgyny, and you could wear beige, blue or white, any of those three. And as a teenager, it was a white skivvy, a navy blue jumper, a pair of beige Stussy pants. You could have Doc Martens or Rossi boots, wide open. And Australia, it was also, the recession hit in 91 and Australia just shut down. And it just felt like, to me, Melbourne went from colour to black and white. Like it was a droll time. And when people say the 90s are back, I'm like, oh my God, where? Please, no, it's too soon. Like you couldn't even wear pink. Do you remember that time?
Yes, I remember that. And only certain colours, certain colours were banned with one another. Now, that's a good thing about today. One of my favourites at the moment is gold with a dusty pink, Well, once upon a time, similar to what you're sitting in there, once upon a time, you would never put those two colours together. That was forbidden.
Purple and red weren't allowed together. Pink and yellow weren't allowed together.
Yes, I'm interested to see what happens with that because in my background, I was at one stage a style and colour analysis person. Those people that go around and make recommendations on you should wear this colour. And I wondered if with customisation and our ability to customise things more quickly and visually with the technology tools that are coming, whether we'll swing back to what suits me, what looks good on me, as opposed to sort of this hydrogenous baggy, shapes. And it fascinates me because I wonder, when you stand in front of a mirror and you're in a fitting room, why do you choose one garment over another? What is it? Is it just the fit? Or do we have an innate ability to process a shape, a silhouette, the colours? Like, what is it that will influence our decision? And that fascinates me. And I did a research project when I was studying a Master of Design, and I did it about, I look at horizontal planes because the Fibonacci sequence, the old rule of the golden ratio, do we have an innate ability to balance our horizontal planes like our hemlines and the length of jackets and pants? Do we take a look at the silhouette and go, that doesn't look right. That doesn't. I feel shorter in this. I feel taller in it.
It is. It's. I wish I knew the answer to, because to me it's like gravity. It's what you're saying is totally real. I can look at, especially outfits. I can look at anything and I can tell you exactly its proportions. And I don't know who said they're right or wrong, but it just is what it is. And people are like, oh, you can wear anything you want. I'm like, no, not if you want to look good. Sure. Like, you want to look like a sack, go for it. But, it's also, I think, mechanical as well, because especially with having boobs, very few designers stitch anything. So it's always pulling at the front and it doesn't fit right. And also, speed of production and things, it's poorly designed. I'm like, it's just math. It just mathematically, it doesn't work. Because people do it as well. Everyone has the same hair. And not enough people have, I like height at the crown, obviously. But, this middle part straight down, I'm like, we're not all the same. You've got to, it breaks my heart a little bit. But I think it's just science. I think it's just the way. It's like,
well, with the visual tools that are coming our way, we'll be able to, have photographs of ourselves and work it out. But one thing I did work out, because I've been in this, being able to visualise what something looks like on you before you purchase it, and there's various iterations of it available now on various websites, but it hasn't really taken off because I think quite genuinely, as a customer, we actually don't want to see a picture of ourselves in that garment or that outfit or whatever. We want to see a nice picture of ourselves, but not something that's unflattering, right? We want an idea of what we think it'll look. We're happy to look at it in the mirror and make a snap decision, but seeing it on the screen is something different. And so it's interesting how we balance what we see visually in magazines and trends and on the catwalks of Europe and the big parades and that, how that's translated down and how we adapt to those shapes and silhouettes once we've seen them on certain individuals or we've seen them in certain magazines, and how we process it. We actually process that into making a selection from what's available. I had a shop in Melbourne Central at one stage, and I used to do some short courses for retailers on, if you're a shop assistant and you were serving someone, what you would look for. We know that fabrics have a temperature, for instance. So some fabrics will form, so you put your hand on a garment and it'll feel a lot warmer. Some, especially the man-made fabrics, are colder. If a customer puts their hand out to touch something, it's an indication of, they like it. But things like you can make some pretty quick decisions around when you're looking at a customer's bone structure. Just look at their wrist to see if it's fine bone structure or heavy, and that'll indicate the choice of prints, and the colour of the background print. If you're a larger frame, then don't choose a white background for your prints. Like, there's a whole science and technology that you can weave into helping people make the selection, or at least we're picking out the first garment you want to try on. There'll be a better match. And the issue for me is that knowledge and that for that styling sort of sits outside the actual fashion cycle of things. It sits over there. Some of the big retailers are offered it as a service. And I've always thought it's a tragedy that we don't incorporate it more into our fashion courses and indeed into, our training of our designers and even our pattern makers, because there's certain drafting techniques for different body shapes. For instance, a very round pelvis, which you see in a lot of South American women, will require a different pant fit, different darting, different shape on the side seams, different crotch, completely different to, for instance, an Asian woman who has a much wider but flatter, if you look side on, pelvic shape. And so, but we don't teach that at all. And so we teach, how to do a pant pattern, how to do a jacket pattern, but not what's going to be complementary or flattering, which goes back to some of the things that you were talking about, the frustrations that we have when we try on garments and there's something just not quite right about it. And I keep saying, and when I'm trying to explain it to the men, because they buy on a measurement, for instance, for most of their clothing, although that's changing too, to small, medium and large. But I said, imagine if you went into a shop and, every pant that was available to you didn't have a waist measurement on it and it had small, medium and large. That's what women have to deal with. But also, it'd be like going into Bunnings and they've thrown all the wood out the back in a big pile and said, go find your bit of 4x4 that's 2 metres long, that's what it'd be like. And it's time consuming. There's garments out there that'll be fitting you and that'll be perfect for you, the right colour, right materiality, right shape. But how do you find it?
Yeah, I have a theory on this as well. I can't believe we haven't spoke about this sooner, is I can tell you, like with local brands, like Australian fashion brands, I don't have to see their head designer. I can tell you by trying on their clothes, their body shape. Or whoever is signing off the patterns, I can tell you exactly their measurements and how high or low their boobs are and how big their hips are. Because I have big boobs, no waist, small hips. So I'm quite, I'm not that typical kind of curvy shape. I don't have a waist at all. And so, yeah, it's a nightmare. Like, that's not a nightmare, but once I try something on and I know it's pulling here and it's too big there, I could draw for you the designer's body.
Yeah, well, that's the fit models that they're using. So in fashion, you have a fit model that's your standard. It'll be a dress form, and they'll vary it according to their target market. But, we used to say, because I'm heavily involved in the clothing sizing, it's one of my pet hobby horses, and we tried to get a sizing survey up for Australia 10 years ago and all got it up to the minister's level, and then it got knocked on the head. But the issue is, depending on their target markets, and you're right, the level of knowledge and that's in the design team, the pre-prod team, within the fashion label, or even the fashion designers themselves, they will look at their target market and then adapt what they call their fit models to that target market. But, even with a sample size of 25 of your target market, if you were to line them up, pick out 25, line them up, the shortest to the tallest, right? Pick the one in the middle, in the mean. You can do a fairly good samples and they're the similar age that you want. You can do a pretty good sample size to get your target market right. But the problem with that is, when Rip Curl did their sizing survey, which I think was back in 2012, and they surveyed, was it 2,000? I'm not sure, young women on the beaches of Australia, they discovered that with a hip measurement of 100 centimetres, of those two, there was a variation of 20 centimetres in the waist size. So that means you could have had a waist measurement, like the waist measurements for that 100 centimetre hip measurement varied 20 centimetres, which is a lot. And I maintain that's why hipsters jeans have stayed so popular, because you bypass the waist measurement. So the jeans fit a lot more people and the sales go up. And the sales figures on a Monday morning for that type of product fit good. And that's why we're seeing these little trends come back where waist comes back into jeans, but they don't stay for very long.
Oh, God, that's genius. I'm just taken back many, many years ago, just on the sizing thing. One is, like, to me, Country Road has always notoriously, I don't know what they do now, but notoriously, if you were a size 10, you'd be a size 8 in Country Road. And I always thought that was a good marketing tactic, because who doesn't want to go down a dress size in a day? But then also, years and years ago, like I'm talking in the mid-90s, one of our neighbours was one of the owners of Westco Jeans, if you remember. And I did my work experience at Westco in the fashion department. Yeah, it was so eye-opening for two reasons. One is actually because Westco, they were, so I didn't know that designers, I didn't even know about laggards, early adopters, that kind of thing. And one of the designers, they had 3 in their design team, one of the fashion designers said, if flares are really cool, there's early adopters and then the mainstream takes it. And then there's the people at the end called laggards. That's who we target. We target laggards. And I was like, I had no idea. I just thought they were designing out of trend. I had no idea it was such a tactic. I mean, I was 14, 15 years old, but it kind of changed my life. There was that. But also, Westco used to do a lot of manufacturing in Melbourne. So during my work experience, the manufacturer came in with the like 3, small, medium, large, to put it against the pattern in the boardroom. And all the clothes were smaller than the patterns, like by an inch all the way around. And then the designers explained afterwards that sometimes the manufacturers pinch a little bit off all of the patterns. So then that's why the same product ends up at the market on the weekend without the label. And I thought that was really interesting around sizing as well.
Yeah, there's lots of things that happen. And the thing is, because we don't have a sizing system, so virtually it's left to a current sizing standard for men's or women's in Australia, because it's left up to the market to determine, then each individual label will determine, and the labels that they carry within that overall brand or that group will determine their own sizing and grade rules and that for their size charts. And that's frustrating. One of the things that I've advocated for recently that I think would be great for Australia was we have I think it's NCIS, the National Institute of Measurement. Anyway, they hold the clock, the ruler, right, look after weights and scales. And it was just an idea, but imagine if we had a national database that profiled our population, right, that didn't identify individuals but could tell you, if I typed into the fields, give me a profile of the target market in postcode, blah, 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 aged, 25 to 55, and with these characteristics, how beneficial would that be to every industry in the country, not just fashion or the design sector, but you could do everything from reach studies to how much inventory you needed to carry. If you could get those profiles and pull them up, it would, I've always thought that Australia should be the sampling capital of the world because we've got a good legislative framework. We're at the base of the manufacturing powerhouse in China and in Asia, and we're removed from everywhere, so nobody knows what we're doing. So we could do a lot of, and our main runs here are like a sampling run in the US. So we could become the sampling capital of the world. How good would that be? And I thought, we've got, I think it's 240 ethnic groups. So we've got a diverse population that we can profile in all shapes, and we know there's different shapes with the different ethnic groups in both for men and women. So we know that that's given. We could do wonders for industry just being able to profile our population. And people are getting used to it now because they walk through scanners at airports, right there. It's not the taboo thing that it used to be. But we could get our universities and educators involved, and we could build it. Wouldn't be hard to do.
Especially around sustainability, I never even thought about it's less waste if the clothes actually fit. And also selfishly, we'd all look better, just saying. But sustainably, that makes absolute sense.
Well, less waste. With adopting some of these things, it's less waste. It's the ability to meet the needs of the consumer. If you go into the big transport companies, I went into one in Sydney, I won't name them, but it's huge. And all they do is deliver fashion. And it was like acres of garments going around and round on these tracks. And I'm thinking to myself, the trucks pull up, in the fashion goes out to the retailer, then it comes back, when it's not sold, and then it goes off to these other places to be, I heard a funny comment from a charity once when they were being rung up by some of the retailers to take stock that can't be sold, and the retailer said to them, well, if you can't sell it, what makes you think that we can, in terms of the volume and that. And so then it ends up in landfill. And so I think our ability, when we try to address these problems, we're looking at the end product, but I think we need to go back earlier. All we're doing is trying to reduce the pile at the end, whereas if we don't make the pile so big in the first place. That's what we've got to focus on. And that requires some innovative thinking. But, having a national database, you could do everything from reach studies for manufacturers, on when they need to set up their equipment. It would be good for car people, like people that manufacture or in our case that are designing cars, houses, all sorts of things. Wherever there's a human body involved and you want a measurement, imagine having access to that as a national database.
You know what would sell it to the government? If it meant better outfits for the Olympians to win more medals. The government feels they're both sides. They're big fans of those gold things on the strings around their neck.
That's right. Well, if you set it up properly, you could do longitudinal studies, you could do family, you could start to predict health of your population. I had some chest conditions once, and the professor involved said to me, because we were talking about sizing and the relationship between size of gut and chest and that, and he said, well, we can tell, he said, when you put a pair of men's bathers around the neck of somebody, it's the same as their, I think he was saying it that at the time, it was the same as their waist measurement or something along those lines. He was doing these anecdotal comparisons. So what that said to me is that each of these professions have their own individual ways of relating and measuring things. So it has widespread implications if we could profile our population.
That's the fashion side. What was it like making the switch to design, from one industry to the other?
Yeah, it was really interesting because in the fashion side, we actually had getting back to strong relationships with government. But, in the fashion, you've got fashion designers, right? And then you've got the fashion labels, right? So the cycle for fashion is getting shorter and shorter to deliver to market. Once upon a time, it was 4 seasons, and then the seasons were divided up, and then it got down to 6 weeks, and now it's 2 weeks or some ridiculous amount of time. So in those cycles, you got, depending on the volume, right, of units output, you've got less time to commit to what we call the pre-production space. So that means you have to have very good systems in place to be able to do it. All, in some cases, automated, but well set up. The time you spend as a designer thinking, and depending on the size of your design team, are directly proportional to that. So the design teams in Australia are much smaller, for instance, than the design teams in Europe for fashion. So when I've come across from fashion, where we managed the big companies and the big uniform companies, or we didn't manage them, but we had them as members, like Pac Brands and Yakka and the big workwear companies and Australian Defence Apparel. So in that role, I was exposed to a very broad brush. I even got dragged into the polyester insulation debacle, if you remember that, because of textiles. That was a steep learning curve. But I learned a lot, and it prepared me well for this role in design, funny enough. But I've come into design, and there's no relationship with government other than design weeks. That seems to be about it. But in terms of the work that they do themselves, it's actually a design process. So yes, you do get that in the fashion too, with a lot of the young designers coming through. In fact, some of the work I've just seen is fabulous coming out of Sydney and Melbourne, even, from the other states that exhibit there, from the young designers, is quite amazing. But I was thinking, even with the young ones, I used to see them, because fashion is something called a low barrier to entry sector. So with very little money, you can set up. I could show you how to set up a fashion business for under $500 and you could get going. But what happens is a lot of them tend to borrow money or have savings. They might have $60,000 or whatever. Half of that's chewed up in buying materials and that for their first range. Everybody tells them that their product's great, but when it gets to the marketplace and for people to stump up the cash, it's a different question. And then they're into the next cycle of the next range, and they haven't sold the last range, or they haven't sold enough of the last range, and they're starting to get stuck because they don't have their cash poor. And I remember I used to teach a CAE course of how to create a fashion label in 10 weeks. And I reckon if I had anyone standing by the end of the 10 weeks, that they'd probably make it, or they'd have a chance to make it.
Like Hunger Games.
Yeah, I used to take them on an excursion up and down Flinders Lane, looking in the shop windows, asking them, okay, count how many garments are in that shop. Right, what's the price point? Get a piece of paper out of your bag or back pocket and a pen and write down the numbers. Okay, so how many garments do you think they're going to sell in a day? Right, how many people will you need in the store to sell that many garments? How much do you want to make a year? Do you want to make the basic wage? When they start to do those basic calculations, they go, oh dear. Right, so that's why when you go into some stores and you see, the whole, from the garments packed from floor to ceiling, they need that volume for the turnover. So, but with the design community, so that's the thinking around fashion labels, fashion designers. But when you come into the design sector, industrial design, the interiors, where the product is not such a short cycle, right? And so you've got an individual customer in some cases in industrial design, and you've got to meet a target, or as interior design, it's a house, it's a longer production. I think there's more time for the designer, right? Now, some of you will say, no, there's not, but work in fashion and you'll understand how quick the cycles are and the pressure that they're under. What I've noticed is that, having that is a different perspective in their thinking, and I've bought in fashion, for instance, Susan Damasi at Material Byproduct. She is rigid in her design process. She's in the gallery, the NGV in Victoria, and you can follow her on social media. She has something called Material Byproduct as her label, and she's rigid in her design, thinking about design and what she's doing. But her product is in the custom-made space, so she's delivering to an individual, and so therefore her pricing is such accordingly so that she can make a living. And I think when you come into all the different disciplines like graphic design, now graphic design is different again. They're all different. Industrial graphic, interiors, they vary widely, and all the things that sit under jewellery design, exhibition design, they vary. But generally speaking, the design process is adapted to that discipline depending on the size of the brief and the dollars available and the task at hand, right? And the designers themselves, their processes and how they go about it. But that's what I love. You've got a problem to solve, ask a designer, ask a good one. They will work to a brief, even if you've only got, $500, they will work to it and give you a good solution.
Yeah, especially like what we do, commercial retail design. Like, bring me everything. Tell me all of it. Do you hate pink? Do you love pink? Like, even forget the customer, and because you're dealing with so many people there's so many stakeholders with commercial and retail interiors. You've got the landlords, the RDMs, the owners, the investors, the staff, the product, the customer, all that stuff, branding, marketing, which I love. Like, it makes it so much easier. It's hard. You've got to put your back into it, and you can't stand on ceremony. You're not an artist. You've got to deliver against that. But there was something also you were saying just before that, though. Oh, with the differences. And I wonder as well, because when you're talking about fashion, and it's a bit squarer as in the process, and I wonder if that's because the ROI per product is very transparent and it's close to finance. Like you were saying, the figures come in on Monday. Whereas in design, jewelry's a bit different, but certainly like what we do, or even web design, interiors, industrial, we're just one of a team. We don't have as much control in it. We are brought in, we do our job. Best it gets executed well, but it's very much out of our hands. We don't, often we're brought in as, contractors or agency people. We're not even in-house. So it is harder for us. Like, we're a bit more like stray cats out in the wild.
That's a really good point. even with interiors, with the design and the D&C contracts and that are out there at the moment, and then what happens after that goes through. But you'll find that happens in fashion too a bit, because like you were saying previously about things being smaller than what was specified, and that happens, from what I can see, very much in interiors, in the construction industry, when depending on availability. And we know we've had material shortages at the moment, so that's been a big influence. But yeah, I was interested in the hospitality space too. So do you, in terms of when you're designing for those layouts, like do the restaurateurs take into consideration the comfort of their customers?
And herein lies the rub. It depends on the investor. What are they willing to pay for? I think, of course, if it's a chef-run, if you go to Attica, you can feel every fibre has been handpicked for a purpose-built reason. And then when you go to one of the big chains, not like Denny's chain, but, like one of the pub groups that are out in Australia, he can, I know, I agree, because it's heartbreaking, because especially eating, it's so central, literally all of your senses. Very rarely do you go out in public and utilise your mouth. Each to their own. But yeah, it's one of the most heartbreaking things, and it looks shiny on the outside. And I always say this, but I can tell you everything by the build. If there's the carpet spec'd, and is there underlay? No underlay is sad day. The investor got involved.
Yeah, okay. Because I always think, like noise in a restaurant and that sort of thing, especially in some of them where it's all cement or it's all steel chairs, cement floors, and the echoing and that sort of thing. And I thought, again, it comes back to temperature. If it's a hot day, you don't mind sitting on a cold seat, sitting down there. But mostly in Melbourne, it's cold, so you want something that's a bit warm and comfortable when you sit down. And how that impacts the consumer, going back to designers and temperature and measurement and all those things that should come into their thinking but don't factor high enough, I don't think, in our education system. While I'm on that subject of measurement, there's so many different ways we can measure today. Have you seen the latest products, like even on your smartphone, what you can do with measurement? It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and the 3D scanning, all of that stuff. With your body profiling project, it would also extend into furniture design and hospitality design, because I am short-bodied. So when I go to a bar, and if I sit at a bar stool with a bar top table, because I'm short-bodied, I'm literally eating like a small child. And it drives like that distance. Nobody thinks about it. I'm like, has anyone sat and actually tried to eat like this? You look like a moron.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. There's a little project that we used to do to try and get the sizing issue across to everybody, where we'd sit two people at a table that were different heights, but one had long legs and one had short legs, but one had a short leg with a long body and the other had long legs with a short body. And when they sat them down, they looked the same height. But when they stood up, there was a huge difference between the two of them. And everyone's always shocked at that. But that's what we're dealing with when we're designing for the general public. So getting back to your original question about the differences between the fashion and the design sector, there are little things like that. The fashion sector prepared me well because it's ruthless, in many ways. It's free market and it's ruthless, and it's survival of the fittest. In the design sector, it's more that I found so when I was at the previous body, it was what we call an employer body, whereas I've come into this body and this looks after the profession, so it's about a professional. So one was more about the entity, this one's more about the individual and their career path. So that was a big difference. And I sort of had to figure out and make an adjustment in my thinking about how that worked. But as an ex-educator, I'm quite passionate about the career path of a professional, right from when they aspire to when they're acknowledged at the end of their careers and everything in between, and how we can help them. And I think the biggest spaces, we work at the DIA at the moment on a framework of the 4 A's, A4s, if you want to call it, aspire, acquire, accredit and acknowledge. So they're the sort of, you want to be a designer, so what do you need if you're wanting to starting out? What tools, what information should we have for them? And then there's the acquire qualification. So in that transition to, what course should I do, what qualification, there's a piece of work for us to do in the transitions. And then once you acquire your credentials, and you transition to employment, there's a space for this to play there about, how do you prepare your portfolio, all of these sorts of things, recruitment, going for a job, introducing matchmaking, all that sort of thing with employers. And then when you're accredited, so in that accreditation, there's work to be done there in preparing them to that profession, for the profession of design. And then there's another piece of work to do, particularly if they go into business for exporting, so they're going, moving in that space, and then acknowledging their careers over a lifetime, which we sort of play in that space as well. So, and that's really the stories when you hear those. We've just had our Hall of Fame, and you hear the stories, the lifetime stories of what they've achieved and what they've done. It's such a moving event. Like, it's so moving to hear them talk, and you always come away feeling inspired and elevated and with the work that they do. And you think, this isn't fair. We don't value this enough in this country. Like, this is ridiculous. These guys are heroes. Oh, these girls, these people are heroes with what they've achieved. And some of them have done amazing things that have flown under the radar. And when we did the other thing that reminds me, because of what you said before, is when we did our survey of where members are working from their projects, 20% of our membership base are doing projects overseas, which I was surprised at. That was a high number. I thought, wow, that's pretty good.
That's awesome. I'm a big advocate of Australian designers working overseas, getting overseas as fast as you can. Like, the world is big and wide and round. Someone's invented the wheel, so have at it. Just get amongst it as fast, because it's hard. Because sometimes we get island, mentality here, and the world just gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yeah, but we belong to all the international design groups, and the stuff that we're doing here is matches anything that I see overseas, if not betters in some circumstances. One of the things that Aussies are good at is, and we're known for overseas, and which I think we should develop more, is our Aussie lifestyle. We're known for casual. We're good at it, And I think, we've got one of the biggest, we lost the automotive, but we've still got one of the biggest caravan brands in the world is here in Melbourne. And boat building and recreational vehicles, we're good at this stuff. Why not focus on that? Focus on sampling and get really good at it and with lots of research. So I think I'm quite passionate, you probably hear it in my voice about this, because I think design would have, if they just tweak the frameworks a little bit and have us that would value designers and their work, it would be so good for the Australian community and Australian in general, and our reputation overseas. Because in some instances, unfortunately, our reputation has been tarnished as being we're knocking off things, and that's not a good reputation to have. Some of the stories I hear around fashion and that are not good.
Yeah, I remember the wine industry came under attack when they started to lose the provenance of the grapes of where it was grown, and the grapes were always getting mushed in together and mass exports and stuff. And I think it goes back to the thing as well, we're talking about the design industry and the trying to corral, put an octopus in a string bag. We have these great creatives and we have great projects and great executions. However, once a designer of any ilk gets up, the investors come in, and the investors usually want to make money. and the designer wants to create, and sometimes it's harmony and sometimes the whole thing just gets smashed. And you can see it where beautiful brands, especially fashion, grow, and then all of a sudden the quality dips off, the shop build dips off, and you can tell, like I can tell you in that moment, that's when we've accidentally tipped more to one person's agenda than the other.
Yeah, and unfortunately, financial imperatives, probably factor in as a high priority, if not the highest priority and driver. But I think the good thing about Australia and design communities, we've got a healthy, what I call mushrooming, coming through environment, because they can set up a design business, register their ABN, get their domain name, get a website. All of those can be done on freebies these days, to make a start. And in the case of fashion, if you need to find materials, you go to the fabric jobbers and the designers for their offcuts of the last season or whatever to get a start. And with the case, the one I'm looking at the moment, I was just talking about with one of my team this morning, in the graphic area, we need to form a town hall pretty quick with what's coming and facing the graphic designers. And, the copyright issues and protection, what's going to happen, because if you can knock off a website in under 10 seconds or whatever they're saying now, the problem is, how's the consumer going to know the difference between someone who can deliver an original thought, product or whatever, and someone who can't? How are they going to know the difference? And so you could knock off one of our leading design agencies in the country, change a few words in it, call it a different name, substitute a few images, off you go, with no qualifications or experience whatsoever, and take the money. So what are we going to do? How are we going to protect the consumer from that?
Yeah, exactly. And the designers as well that are doing the right thing.
Well, it's the original thought, the thought process a designer will go through, and that comes with not just their learnings and their quals, but also their experience and the jobs that they've done previously. I think that will become more important for the consumer to be able to work that out. Oh, well, they've worked on this project and this project, testimonials, references, all that sort of thing will be much more important moving forward, because the customer's not going to be able to know whether it's AI generated or it's... Now, in some cases it might be, people would argue it might be better, but that's only because that AI has been generated off other people's work.
I wonder if we could equate it to realism versus pictorialism, like with painting, thinking of when, the masters got really good at painting it really accurately, and then Renoir came along and he painted, it's not Chloe, but it's that woman staring defiantly, naturally in the nude. And that realism was born, and then we went into Impressionism, and that, a few different things happened that were the catalyst for that. But I wonder if that's what it is. It's that things being a little bit more handmade, because the thing is with the AI and stuff and the AI rendering, it looks good, but it's very impenetrable. It's like, social media now, the big platforms are prioritizing for want of a better term, slap together content as opposed to the perfect content, because like you just said, it's how is the consumer going to relate? Well, it has to be relatable. And after a while, we're all probably getting a little bit sick of smoothie.
Like my Instagram feed, which I used to love looking at, is terrible. And that the algorithms make assumptions. What if I leave something on an ad and walk out the room and don't come back for an hour? It thinks that I like it. You've got to be joking. Seriously, guys, don't do it.
I totally agree. Well, on that note, laughing on high, thank you so much for your time today, Jo. It has been delightful, and I've written many notes, lots of gold nuggets. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Renee.